Here we're starting section 2 in our chapter. It's titled Congressional Reconstruction. So at the end of 1865, President Johnson announced that Reconstruction was over, like he was done, he was ready to move on. We set up these things to help these freed slaves, these freedmen, build a life. He's like, I've checked, in his mind, he checked all the boxes. So he's washing his hands. He's like, done. Let's move on with our country and let's focus on other things for once. And this was only after 1 year. And we know that like nothing really changes in just a year. Like you're not going to change, especially something of this magnitude. So Congress was like, what? So many of these radical Republicans did not agree with Johnson. And remember, these were Republicans. That's the same political party that he was affiliated with, but these are radical ones. And so these were a group of people in Congress that they believed that we should be doing more than just emancipating the slaves. We need to do more to help them and be successful. So there was the leader of this group in the House of Representatives was led by Thaddeus Stevens, who you can see pictured on the top left. And he was from Pennsylvania, land of those loving Quakers. And they were led by Charles Sumner of Massachusetts in the Senate. And we know Massachusetts, those are rebel rousers. So these were, and he's pictured in the bottom left corner. So these two gentlemen took the lead to really try and voice this need for continual change and effort. They believed Reconstruction could not be over until freedmen were granted full citizenship rights. So they had to have just as many rights as the white person standing beside them. And they believed that the federal government needed to take a more involved role in Reconstruction. We can't just give these people a slap on the wrist in the South and expect them to do what's right when it's something that's so like ingrained into their lives a different way. So the radical Republicans wanted to do a lot more in this Reconstruction period. So in 1866, the radical Republicans joined with some lawmakers to enact two bills to help freedmen. The first one was to extend the Freedmen's Bureau, which we discussed in the previous chapter, which helped them, get wages, get work, education. So when the president was like, "Oh, we're done," he was going to, the Freedmen's Bureau was going to end at that point. But this act extended the life for I think another 3 more years. The Civil Rights Act was the next thing that was passed. Civil Rights Act of 1866. This declared freemen to be full citizens with the same civil rights as whites. So this was something that they thought needed to be done and was very important. President Johnson declared these things unconstitutional, but Congress overrode his vetoes. Because remember, Johnson didn't really care about slavery or what happened to the people once they were freed. He just more or less wanted to end the war, get on with life, and punish the traitors and bring the state back into the union that it once was. That was his main focus. He didn't care about the African Americans so much. So the 14th Amendment, it says, I have an excerpt of it here. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction, therefore, are citizens of the United States and of the states wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. So, in other words, is the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States. Because remember, in the previous section, we talked about those black codes, and some of those black codes gave gave some of them the rights, but it denied them this whole idea of citizenship. Because if you rewind even more, think back to was it Plessy versus Ferguson, that Supreme Court case where it was made clear that slaves were not even considered citizens of this country. So this is kind of taking that whole idea, that mentality away. And so that if you're not white, you're not considered a citizen of the U.S. So the 14th Amendment is taking away that notion that if you're not a citizen, so if you were born here or if you applied for citizenship here, or you're naturalized, or whatever, then you are considered a full citizen. And you have the same protections as everybody else under the law. So President Johnson was against the 14th Amendment, and he wanted voters to overthrow these Republican lawmakers. But actually, I want to go back to the slide one more time. So it says that in the United States or any states, because remember we have where they're making it clear that the United States sees this and your state government will see this, because I think there's always this argument between like states' rights versus federal rights. So this is making sure that there can't be a states' right argument that legalizes something in their state that's, or makes something illegal in their state that's technically legal at a federal level. So that's an important little thing that you need to make sure when you're reading this. Sorry. Okay, now going back to this next slide. So President Johnson was against the 14th Amendment. He wanted the voters to overthrow these Republican lawmakers, like they're total radicals, they're asking too much, they're stretching for too much, and he thought that they were just being ridiculous asking for all this. Because again, taking away this whole like states' rights a little bit. However, the Republicans won by 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. So some you would call this a mandate in a way. So Congress had control of Reconstruction because they had the majority of the House and they had the majority of the Senate. So this is a Republican held government, Congress. In 1876, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act, despite Johnson being against it. And what this act did was it divided the South into 5 military districts, as you can see here on the map. And each district was governed by a general supported by federal troops. So it's kind of like this martial law that there was a federal person who was obviously loyal to the Constitution, obviously loyal to what Congress is telling them what to do, and they're making sure that these states and their territories are abiding by the rules and the laws that are coming down. Each state government set up were under Johnson's plan were declared illegal, and new governments had to be formed. Because remember, under Johnson said you had to have a new government, new elected officials, blah, 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 from their being a Confederate state or their pre-war government, because those were your radicals. But when they were re-electing and doing everything again, it was the same elected officials. And so now the act is, people were noticing that, you're not going to get change if you don't change your leadership. So that's what this act was wanting to do, was to make sure that we had a good leadership coming forward that actually believed in these ideals that are needed for this whole Reconstruction and growing and moving forward out of this nasty era of slavery. So if you were to be an elective official in one of these states, you had to be a Southerner who was loyal to the Union during the war. Supporters of the Confederacy were also denied the right to vote. So those people who were just in office prior to this, they were ousted from office and they were denied the the right to vote and to have their input in it. So this is making sure that the people who have the voice in the state and in these governments are people who definitely own the same ideals, beliefs, values as the Northerners and like the abolitionists and the people who are wanting to grow the country in this way. Um, so additionally, Congress passed two more acts to reduce Johnson's power to interfere with Reconstruction. Because remember, it's the Army Act, and your president is the commander in chief of the military. So if they're controlling these different districts in the South, then you would think that the president would have like more say over it. So to help safeguard that idea, they passed this Command of the Army Act, which again limited President Johnson's power over the army. And it also, the other act that was passed was the Tenure of Office Act. And this barred the president from firing certain federal officers without the consent of the Senate. So if the president didn't like one of the officers, he couldn't, and it could have been because they were doing stuff that he didn't believe was necessary, like they were too extreme. Well, he couldn't fire them if he thought they were being too extreme or inappropriate without the consent of the Senate, which is important because the Senate is, currently being held by these or under control of this like radical Republican group. So President Johnson was real mad and he declared these acts unconstitutional. And to show that they firmly believed they were unconstitutional, he actually fired one of the officials that were technically protected under this Tenure of Office Act. So what does this happen? This happens to lead to his impeachment. So Congress decided to impeach Johnson for firing the officer, saying it was a violation of the Tenure of Office Act. Um, and Johnson's lawyers argued that the only thing that he did wrong was to oppose Congress. And if it removed him from office, it would set a bad precedent for future presidents who disagreed with their Congress. So if you think about it, like the president, that's why our government was formed this way. We have these checks and balances. So like not one branch can have too much power. So it disperses the power evenly amongst all parts of our government. Well, right here, like I don't necessarily agree with the ideas that Johnson was doing. Like he was trying to let the South hold on to this idea of being able to make a quote legalized slavery with these black codes and whatnot. But I don't agree with that. And Congress strongly disagreed with that as well. And so they're trying to make these things so Johnson couldn't further help the South further their agenda. But at the same time, I agree with Johnson's lawyers because he legally did not do anything wrong, and that Congress is doing their dangdest to be able to override the president in any way that they can. They're kind of like steamrolling him in his own office because they didn't agree with him. So during this impeachment process, you need 2/3 to remove the president from office. However, this man was so lucky he was able to escape removal by one vote. So the next thing this section talks about is sharecropping. So former slaves, they needed land to farm. Like they needed to have money. That was the only thing they were allowed to do was to farm. However, they are totally broke and you have to be able to buy land if you're going to farm land. And they had no money to buy the land. And then on the other side, you had former slave owners. They had all this land and they needed workers, but they had no money to pay the workers. So everyone is just kind of like stuck in this like need and like in this this like tension between needing and having. So how this, cycle was kind of broken was land was divided into plots and rented to them to the farmers. So these giant plantation owners or landowners that once had slaves worked the land for free. They're now dividing this land into plots and they're renting them to these former slaves. But there are also some white people, I'm sure, that took advantage of this as well. Some people paid cash monthly for their rent, and others paid that like equivalent of rent and portions of what they grew and gave that to the landowner, and then the landowner would then be able to make money off of it by selling those goods that were farmed off the land. And that portion was called a share. It was usually about a half or a third of the crops that were grown.